Welcome to the Clements Library Bookworm. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online. After today's presentation, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording and resources that are shared in today's program. It looks like people are finding the chat section, so I encourage you to continue to chime in. Notice that you have some selections about who you send the chat to. If you would, please select all panelists and attendees so that we can participate as a community. You'll notice though that the conversation goes by very quickly. So use the Q&A section to ask questions. You'll be able to find them later. You can also look in there to see what questions other people have asked. If you click the thumbs up, it upvotes them, sends them to the top of the queue. And if you have any further answers or comments on the questions, you can go ahead and comment on them as well. My colleagues Ann Bennington-Helber and Tracy Payovich will be helping to monitor the chat and pasting in helpful links and answering questions there as well. Today's program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. Today marks the commemoration of the Juneteenth holiday. Celebrated annually on June 19th, Juneteenth commemorates slavery in the United States. The date represents the arrival of Union soldiers in Galveston, Texas in 1865 with news of the end of the Civil War and freedom for all who had been in bondage. On the slide, we're sharing a slave's adventures toward freedom, not fiction, but the true story of the struggle, the autobiography of Peter Bruner. So this is available on Happy Trust if you would like to take a closer look at it, and we can provide the link for that as well. Also, I'd like to draw attention to a special program that our colleagues at the Penny Stamp School have put together. At 8 p.m. Eastern Time, you can tune in to dptv.org or the Penny Stamps Series Facebook page to view a presentation by photographer and Afrofuturist Osborne Macharia with beatmaker Blinky Hill. Today's episode of the Bookworm, we are going to talk about battles in the American Revolutionary War. And in just a couple of minutes, I'll introduce our first speaker. But of course, we have to take a quick look at our opening poll. So if everyone would really quickly click your answers, if you haven't had a chance to do so yet. We're discussing how we celebrate the 4th of July, which is coming up. And of course, since it's today, we're talking about the Revolutionary War, it made sense to talk about how we normally celebrate. All right, I'm going to share the results, and we were talking about some fun picnics and family reunions that often happen on the 4th of July, which may not be happening as much this year because of COVID-19, but that seems to be the way that people enjoy celebrating the 4th of July most. And I see attending a parade and with fireworks, of course, are also high on the list. So thanks everybody for participating in that. Now I'd like to introduce Art Acton. Art is a longtime Clements Library associate who received his MA and PhD from Michigan. He taught history at Marietta College in Ohio before going into administration. He retired from Clarion University of Pennsylvania as Associate Vice President for Graduate and Extended Programs. His dissertation was The Diary of William Smith, August 26, 1778 to December 31st, 1779. Smith, the last Royal Chief Justice of New York, was a prolific diarist who lived in New York City and was close to the British High Command, especially Sir Henry Clinton. So, Art, what are you sharing with us today?
Angela, I'm going to do a review of the book Revolution on the Hudson, New York City and the Hudson River Valley in the American War of Independence by George C. Dugan. Let me start at the outset to say I enjoyed this book. It took me back many decades to when I was working on my dissertation on a subject which was also situated in New York City in the Hudson River Valley. This book, although it focuses heavily on the Hudson and New York City, it also is a broader discussion of the American Revolution. It's a fairly typical military history, although it does include some social elements. It focuses primarily on the British strategy during the course of the war and then some of their specific objectives and tactics. This book has a principal thesis, which was that both sides believed that if the British seized the Hudson River and held it, they would win the war. Seizing the river could cut off the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies and would bring victory to the British. This was believed by the entire British government and high command, including King George III, Lord North, and also Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for the American Department. On the American side, General Washington as well as Congress believed that severing the Hudson River could lose the war from the Americans. So this was the strategy of the war from the outset. And it was a belief which continued in American history for decades. Even Alfred Thayer Mahan, the famous naval historian, indicates that it was the ideal strategy and it was badly managed by the British. Otherwise, they might have won the war. The author of this book, however, argues very effectively, I think, that this was a mistaken idea. It was false and would never work. The British could, in fact, never succeed in conquering the Hudson River, as evidenced by the campaigns during the war. And secondarily, even if they had conquered it, they couldn't hold it because the American colonists had control of both sides of the Hudson River. Still, the British pursued this strategy beginning in 1776 when Lord Howe, the admiral of the British Navy, and his brother Sir William Howe, the commander of the army, seized the city of New York. They believed that they could push up the Hudson and New York would be the best base for them to act. However, 1776 was not a good year. They captured the city. They didn't feel they had time to push up the Hudson. They also were trying to engage in some kind of peace negotiations with the Americans, which of course failed completely. The next year presented greater opportunities as General Burgoyne, who was the new commander of troops sent to Canada, and he had several thousand troops, and he began his progress down the Ohio River, the Hudson River system, and with an objective of reaching Albany in New York. However, he soon found the going a little bit difficult, and he felt it was necessary to call on his partners, so to speak, for assistance. Sir Henry Clinton was located in New York, commanding those troops, but he had not enough troops to spare. Sir William Howe, for some reason, decided to attack Philadelphia, going in the opposite direction, although he believed he had enough troops to provide assistance, but he didn't have time to get there. The result was that Burgoyne was surrounded and forced to surrender, at Saratoga that year. The British, one would have thought, would have given up this idea after the failure of Saratoga, but still it was their objective during the course of the entire war, although the energy with which they pursued it declined. After the failure at Saratoga, it opened the opportunity for the French to enter the war, and this changed the British objectives. They moved to focus then on the lucrative French sugar islands, and moved the land fighting to the south with the capture of Charleston in 1780 and the movement of Cornwallis's troops from South Carolina on into North Carolina. Still up north, the British still considered the seizure of the Hudson River as an objective they wanted to achieve. Thus, Sir Henry Clinton entered into negotiations with Benedict Arnold, hoping to seize control of West Point. This, of course, failed, but it indicates that they were still interested in this objective. Another theme which the author pursues, but one which is identified in a number of other works, was the friction which occurred in the British and also in the American High Command. Specifically, the difficulties between Sir William Howe and Sir Henry Clinton made the operations in New York and elsewhere difficult, and also between Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis when Clinton was in command. Clinton's biographer, Sir Henry William Wilcox, indicates that Clinton was a very difficult person. He didn't work well with either his superiors or his subordinates. Wilcox, in his biography, indicates that Clinton suffered from severe psychological issues, which made these problems difficult and contributed significantly to the tactical and strategic mistakes which the British made. Similarly, there were some issues in the American High Command. Horatio Gates and Charles Lee, who were generals in the American Army, both thought themselves superior to Washington, and they intrigued with Congress, where they found some support to get Washington removed, but of course this failed. Couple last notes that I wanted to make. This book was a readable book. It required no previous knowledge of the American Revolution. However, there were a couple things I found frustrating. First of all, the author provides a great deal of information in terms of troop movements, particularly in the seizure of New York City, moving the troops from Manhattan to the Jersey Shore to elsewhere. But he provides no maps to help the reader see where these troop movements are going on. And it's very frustrating to try and figure where the troops are going if you have no maps to follow. He only provides two maps, which are seen on the screen, which indicate where the troops were and how they were moving, but the detail is so fine that you can't really process in any degree of accuracy where things are happening. The second objection which I had to the book was, as I finished the book and finally went on to look at the bibliography, I discovered there was a large section of notes commenting on the text. But when reading the text, the author provided no superscripts to help you find the notes, so that it was very frustrating to discover at the end that there were all these notes that you might want to have looked at while you were reading the text. Lastly, I would mention that he has a very thorough biography and covers most of the resources that one would expect to find there. However, the interesting thing is he includes no manuscripts in his resources or references to maps. And in particular, he makes no reference to the very significant and actually great manuscript collection that the Clements libraries had, including all of the Clinton manuscripts and Howe manuscripts and a number of others.
Thank you, Art. Thanks so much. Just a reminder, everybody, we will entertain questions at the end of both presentations. So if you do have questions, please put those in the Q&A section. At this time, I also want to take a moment just to recognize that today we are featuring some of the Clements Library's one-of-a-kind Revolutionary War maps. Through the generosity of Barry Lawrence Ruderman Antique Maps, we were able to digitize 560 18th century manuscript maps, and 197 of those relate directly to the Revolutionary War. There are over 300 Revolutionary War maps in the Clements Library Image Bank, so you can enjoy taking a look at those as well. All right. Thanks again, Art, and we'll talk to you a bit more at the end of the program. But now I would like to welcome Tom Wagner. Tom is a longtime resident of Ann Arbor, coming here as an undergraduate from Dearborn in 1959 and earning 2 degrees from the School of Natural Resources. After retiring from the Willow Run Laboratories of the University of Michigan, Tom began researching his ancestors and learned of their involvement in the Battle of Guilford and the complex chain of events leading up to the battle and the lessons we can learn from it today. Thanks for being here with us, Tom, and I'd love to hear what you've learned.
Okay, thank you, Angela. As you know, I'm a great fan of the Clements Bookworm and am happy to have an opportunity to make a contribution. Let me start by saying that I'm a geographer, not a historian. However, I'd like to talk about a Revolutionary War battle that occurred in a place that I've never been, but has some personal interest. Ironically, I had made plans to be in Guilford, North Carolina today, but unfortunately, COVID-19 got there first. So I've changed my plans, and I'll share with you what I've learned from books. I suppose without the pandemic, I'd have much more to tell you from an actual visit to the national battlefield, but likewise, I might not be talking to you. I'm not really an expert on the Revolutionary War, and in fact, as a disclaimer, I would have to say that until a year ago, I barely knew that there was a Revolutionary War south of Virginia. Perhaps like other Northerners of my generation, the Revolutionary War was all about Concord, Bunker Hill, Boston, the Liberty Bell, Valley Forge, and the Continental Congress. So it came as a shock to me to discover that this particular battle in North Carolina near the close of the war had some of my ancestors that were involved. And that there had been a battle there that was also a turning point for the largely stalemated Revolutionary War. The last major battle in the North was at Monmouth in New Jersey on June 28, 1778. The battle that we'll be talking about occurred on March 15, 1781, almost 3 years later. Until the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, the initial success of the British Southern campaign became a series of cat and mouse engagements with the British Army chasing the undermanned Patriot deployments in the Carolina backcountry. Well, on the face of it, Guilford Courthouse was a contest between British Army under General Lord Charles Cornwallis. He was an earl, and the mix of continental and local militia forces under General Nathaniel Greene. In reality, it reactivated a continuing contest for control between Tidewater loyalist plantation slave owners and the many upland farmers and settlers who were pouring into the Piedmont and the mountainous areas of the Carolina frontier. Some were English, Irish, Scottish, mainland European. Some were pacifists like the Quakers and Moravians. Most were peaceful farmers who just really wanted to be left alone. After the fall of Charleston in May of 1780 and the defeat of the Continental Army at the Battle of Camden in August, things looked pretty bleak for the American Revolution. However, some of the fiercest fighting of the war occurred after that time. This map shows the location of some of the larger conflicts leading up to the Guilford Courthouse, which is in the upper center of the map. The British thought they had widespread support in the South, a misconception promoted by loyalists from the coastal tidewater residing in London. The result, however, was a hornet's nest of backwoods raiding, score settling, vigilantes under the cover of the fight for or against independence. I've been doing my homework. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse is reasonably well documented, as are the events leading up to it, which we could spend weeks describing. It would make, with its colorful characters, a stunning true history sort of Game of Thrones type of biopic if anybody ever wanted to do it. However, in preparation for my now postponed visit to Guilford National Military Park, I'm indebted to Lawrence Babbitt's and Joshua Howard's detailed book, Long, Obstinate, and Bloody, The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2009. Lawrence Babbitt's is a longtime military archaeologist and historian at East Carolina University in Greenville and has written extensively about the Southern theater of the Revolutionary War, including his well-regarded book about the Battle of Cowpens. Joshua Howard is a research historian at the North Carolina Office of Archives and History. A disclaimer, I don't know either of these gentlemen. I get no commission for plugging their well-researched book. They are most certainly qualified, and if I understand it correctly, they reviewed some 980 post-war pension applications and many more war correspondences of both American and British combatants, many for the first time. I like this book, but unless you're looking for an ancestor, which I was, there was quite a bit of detail concerning individual officers and their divisions, and even the veterans, what they did after the battle, where they went, where they ended up. Also, as a geographer, I greatly appreciated the line maps that corresponded to the pre-battle movements of troops, but there were 3 black and white maps of the battle stages, which seemed a bit busy, and I suspect were originally rendered in color, but which would have made them more comprehensible. This 238-page book starts with Nathaniel Greene, December 1780, his appointment to pick up the pieces after the continental losses of Savannah and Charleston, and in particular, the humiliating defeat of Horatio Gates at Camden in August 1780. Starting with Morgan's unexpected victory, Cowpens in January 1781, and some very fortuitous winter rains with swollen rivers and bad information. In the British pursuit of Greene's highly mobile army, one can feel Cornwallis's frustration with not being able to confront Greene directly in a stand-up fight. But by March, both Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis and Major General Nathaniel Greene were itching for a conventional head-on knockout clash. Although with his superior numbers, Greene was fairly confident, but he knew he'd still win strategically if Cornwallis failed to destroy his army. He had Cornwallis, of course, was aiming to do exactly that. He had little regard for Greene's rebel forces and supreme confidence in his own seasoned British and Hessian troops. He wanted a glorious battlefield victory to his credit. On the other hand, Greene hoped for a win, but his overall strategy was not to lose. The New Garden Quaker community experienced the start of the battle with Light Horse Harry Lee's cavalry meeting Tarleton's hated British Legion on the New Garden Road and drew the British forces into the Guilford Courthouse battlefield. After the battle, the New Garden Friends cared for 250 wounded British and American soldiers in their meeting house and individual homes. After attempting to mend the wounded, the Friends buried both British and American soldiers who did not survive the battle. General Cornwallis left close to 100 of his wounded with the New Garden Quaker community when he retreated to Wilmington 4 days after the battle. General Greene also learned of the pacifist Quakers' generosity in caring for his wounded and wrote a letter to the Friends requesting they provide relief, quote, relief of the suffering wounded at Guilford Courthouse, unquote. The meeting responded that they would do all that lies in their power to assist the wounded despite the recent theft of their resources by both British and American soldiers. This Quaker community included my 6th great-grandfather. To make a long story short, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse pitted close to 2,000 mostly British and Hessian regulars against a combined force of approximately 4,450 patriots, equally divided by long-term regulars and short-term militia. I say approximately because these volunteer and drafted militia had a habit of coming and going and would often disappear prior to and during battles. State and local militia were the bane of all commanders from George Washington on down in the Revolutionary War. General Greene, counseled by Daniel Morgan, the brilliant commander of the Patriot victory at Cowpens, if they fight, that is the militia, you will beat Cornwallis. If not, he will beat you and perhaps cut your regulars to pieces. As unreliable as they were, the outcome of this and many other Revolutionary War battles was dependent really on the militia, then their discipline and leadership. On the afternoon of March 15th, 1781, after marching 12 miles, since dawn on empty stomachs, column after column of British and Hessian regulars marched on in close ranks to the sound of fife and drums onto the field in front of the woodlot and a slight rise near Guilford Courthouse. General Greene had stationed his defensive lines, so-called defense in depth. The first line consisting of the North Carolina, Virginia. Could we see the next slide, please? That Greene knew would likely run at first contact. He hoped that they would get off a few shots to thin the advancing British columns before retreating, which in fact, many of them did. Retreating into the woods of the second line, there was vicious hand-to-hand combat at close range. Continuing to take tremendous losses, the veteran British pushed forward and eventually made it to the third rebel line adjacent to the courthouse itself. These comprised Greene's most seasoned Delaware and Maryland regulars. There they met stiff resistance. Observers said that this was the fiercest fighting of the entire war, and conjectured that at this point in the battle, it could have gone either way. But after 2 hours of the most brutal hand-to-hand fighting, The ever cautious Greene gave the signal to withdraw. The army did so in an orderly manner with most of his troops left intact. They reassembled several miles away. Cornwallis initially sought to pursue, but he quickly realized that his army was in tatters and was in no condition to readdress the enemy. Indeed, later the tally of losses of dead, wounded, and missing in action showed that the British losses amounted to 93 killed, 413 wounded, and 22 missing in action. Some 50 additional wounded were left unprotected in the woods the following night, rain-soaked night, who would die before morning. 27% of his army was knocked out. Almost half of his officer corps were lost. 17 wagons carried the wounded to the nearby Quaker meeting house. Greene's losses were less, except for the missing in action. 76 killed, 184 wounded. It's conjectured that of his 1,049 missing in action, most were militia who simply went home. The last thing you wanted to be in the Revolutionary War was a prisoner of war. You were likely to die of untreated wounds, disease, and starvation. Without the missing in actions, Greene lost less than 6% of his army. But unlike the British, these men could be replaced with fresh volunteers and drafted men. And many of the militia who ran would later fight another day in other locations, including my fifth great-grandfather of the North Carolina Dragoons. The outcome was that Cornwallis had demoralized and ruined his army for no strategic gain. He had not defeated Greene. Indeed, he had to abandon this part of the Carolinas because he could neither feed nor resupply his troops. Cornwallis repaired to Wilmington on the coast and made the fatal error 6 weeks later of invading Virginia, giving up on the Carolinas, and within 7 months, getting himself trapped at Yorktown. But that's a different story. I welcome your questions, corrections, and comments. Angela.
Thank you so much, Tom. All right, everybody. As a reminder, we're going to be answering questions, so go ahead and put those in the Q&A section. I am going to do just a couple of housekeeping slides, and then we'll continue with questions until about 11 o'clock. All right, so next week, please join us again as we welcome our 2011 Prize Fellow, Scott Hierman, to discuss his research from the Clements Library and his book, The Alchemy of Slavery, Human Bondage and Emancipation in the Illinois Country, 1730 to 1865. Then, on July 3rd, we'll take a holiday. There will be no Bookworm on July 3rd. And as you can see, we have some exciting programs scheduled for the rest of July, including a conversation between Martin Bruckner and Mary Pedley on July 10th, and Martin's book, The Social Life of Maps. On the 17th, we'll do another Collector's Corner, and Jack Dio will talk about his wonderful collection of photographs. And on the 24th, we'll be talking about business and labor history with Brian Lusky and his new book, Min is Cheap, and Dyke Benjamin from the American Trust for the British Library will be joining us as a panelist to talk about his Business for Good seminar and discuss with Brian Lusky. As a reminder, you will receive an email with the recording from today's program and the resources discussed today. And now that you've signed up for the Bookworm, you'll receive a reminder next week for the episode. And if you're unable to attend live, you'll still receive the email with the recording and resources. You can also view previous recordings on our website. We began the Bookworm as a way to stay in touch during the stay-at-home order. And just as a reminder, the Clements Library has not yet reopened. So if you're wondering about that, you can continue to check out our updates on our website. And we hope to start being able to remotely fill some requests and do some work within the library, but it will be a while yet before we're able to welcome researchers back into the library. So we continue this Bookworm as a way to stay in touch with everyone. And please, if you're interested in supporting the work that we do, consider making a gift. We thank many of you for already supporting us financially. In addition, we're looking for people to sponsor our episodes of the Bookworm, and we'll be reaching out soon with more information about that. Okay, so let's get to our questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A section. And I'm gonna pull it up and see what we have. All right. Could you comment on the difficulty that maintaining a large body of troops in the small city of New York involved?
I would say that it was a challenge for the British, particularly as the American forces withdrew from Manhattan. They burned down about half of the city, so that there was a very severe shortage of living space. And in terms of food supplies, initially they had a lot of support from loyalists, particularly in New Jersey. But as the war progressed, the loyalists became more disillusioned, and particularly as some of the foraging parties, most specifically by the Hessians, were particularly brutal in scouring the land for everything they wanted. Now, later on, the troops, a large majority of the troops were moved out of New York, particularly with the Southern campaign. And Clinton in New York had only a very small force, which would have been much easier to support.
Thank you. Let's see. Bill Marvel says, Art or Tom, do either of you know what the opposing troop proportions were in the Hudson Valley and in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey theater in 1777 to 1778, and how they perceived importance of those theaters, how the perceived importance of those theaters affected their distribution? Did one theater draw troops off from the other with an effect on the results?
Yes, I would say they did. And as I mentioned, in 1777, a vast number of the troops had been moved to Philadelphia under Sir William Howe to capture that city. And Clinton had only a very small portion of the troops. And then, as I also mentioned, a very large number of troops were shipped to Canada and put under the command of John Burgoyne, who later surrendered at Saratoga. So, in a sense, Burgoyne and the American, holding the Americans in upstate New York, that was part of the emphasis on this strategic objective. But the paradox is that focusing on the Hudson River was the major objective, but Howe moved all of his forces to Philadelphia. And there's always been a lot of argument of why he did this and whether he thought he could get back in time or what. But it's a little odd and hard to explain why he did that.
Thank you. Mary is asking, what is the date of the Battle of Guilford?
March 15th, 1781.
All right. I'm just going to type that in. Thank you. Rex is saying that it would be interesting to know the role of those who made the Mecklenburg Declaration in 1775 possible in the Guilford battle.
I'm not familiar with that particular document, so I don't have an answer to that.
All right. Maybe Rex can type in some more information about what the connection that he's thinking might be there.
I will add, though, that this was really, as I mentioned before, a continuation of a civil war. There had been the regulators a decade earlier that had fought against the Tidewater loyalists that were controlling much of the state by people that were feeling in the Piedmont and upper hills the unfair use of courts and taxing that was being done.
Thank you. Let's see. One of the biggest problems facing the British is what military figures call the force to space ratio, in which they had insufficient troops to hold the extensive physical territory they sought to control with the modest number of troops they had and the few number of loyalists they could recruit. Not sure if there's a question within that. Does anybody have a comment on that?
That's sort of what I was the point the author was trying to make is
okay.
The British could not control the Hudson River. They just didn't have enough forces. The Americans were able to cross back and forth at will. So, and the other point was the British grossly overestimated the support of loyalists, and some of the support they alienated in the process of the war. So I think those are important things to note.
Right.
The other thing to add is that the Declaration of Independence that had, I don't know, 27, 28 grievances against the British, but it never included the confiscation, general confiscation of arms. Some people are mistaken about that. They certainly disarmed combatants, but in the countryside, since colonial times, since the Pilgrims, people had arms, and to disarm the public would have caused a great furor because you would be disarming not only loyalists, but the vast majority of the people who were basically neutral and simply wanted to get on with their lives. And guns were an important part of each family, particularly on the frontier.
All right. Oh, Rex is talking about one may see the great chain that was used to guard the Hudson, which is, you can see at the military academy. Its effectiveness has been discussed a lot, but psychologically, perhaps it was even more important. Do you have a comment on that, Art?
Well, it was one of those key points that if you didn't take control of West Point, you weren't going to be able to move up the Hudson River. That's why Clinton tried to get it by a deal from Benedict Arnold. But I don't know whether it was a psychological objective or whether its fall would have been damaging to the Americans. But as I pointed out, there was no way the British were going to gain control of the Hudson River.
Right. Thank you. Mary is wondering, Tom, about your sources for genealogy and how you found this history and linked it to the Battle of Guilford.
Well, there were never a number of references that I consulted, not just this particular one, which was actually pretty complete because, as I mentioned, the authors had reviewed almost 1,000 different requests for pensions, and included thumbnail sketches of most of the major commanders, leaders, and even what happened to them after the war. There is documentation concerning those that have participated in the Revolutionary War at different, it's not necessarily complete, particularly in reference to the militias. My ancestor fought in the Battle of Cowpens and in the subsequent wars, but my guess is that he, along with most of the other militia, took off early and really didn't brag about that. Is there references to the people that fought? The answer is yes. They're online. I don't have that right in front of me.
Yeah, I think, as Tom points out, one of the major sources are the petitions by soldiers and or their spouses. I found one of my ancestors was a combatant in the Revolutionary War and served in Washington's army, and his wife was applying for the pension after his demise.
My Quaker relative, that fought in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, never claimed his pension because he was, became a Quaker and was embarrassed by the fact that he had killed people. And it was his son, actually, that ended up making the claim for the pension, which was authorized by Congress, I think, in 1828 or something like that.
Right, so those are good sources. Yeah, so it's interesting that you both have found those connections. Let's see. Dyke Benjamin is asking, what might be similar business and social issues in the Revolutionary and Civil Wars? Wondering, if you have any comments on that.
Well, some people say the Civil War was a continuation, really, of unsettled matters of the Revolutionary War, particularly with respect to slavery. There certainly were issues of slavery in the fighting. Keep in mind that probably 50 to 60% of the residents of South Carolina were slaves, 20 to 30% in Virginia at the time. And so there were discussions of recruiting slaves and by the British and also by the Americans, which were really flatly rejected by the legislatures of both of those states.
It is surprising, I think, that there were a significant number of slaves in New York and in surrounding areas, and which most people don't think of slavery in the North. And although it does disappear subsequent to the American Revolution, there were a significant number of slaves up in the northern parts of the United States at this time. And as Tom mentioned, British did try to attract them to work on their side and essentially emancipated, I think, those who made it into the British lines.
Thank you. Let's see. So Rex has a comment here. The Scots-Irish had great communications throughout their regions of the backcountry, up and down, north and south in the mountain regions, and the declarations, one as early as 1743 in southern Pennsylvania, included Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania in 1775 also. Associators was often a name under which the Scots-Irish operated, often as a militia. So this might be part of his comment from earlier. I'm not sure if that's something that you
Some of that independent spirit of the backcountry with the Scots carried on over into the American government actions under Washington when he sent troops out to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion in Westmoreland County and Western Pennsylvania.
Keep in mind that many of the people in the backcountry had rifles as opposed to the guns that were the normal issue of the Army. And they were deadly at long range. But if you were in hand-to-hand fighting, especially against the British that had bayonets, you were definitely at a disadvantage. You could only use your rifle as a club. And so that was one of the reasons why at least the riflemen, which were initially deadly, fled. If you saw a wall of enemy coming toward you with fixed bayonets, well, I think I'd be inclined to run.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about those different weapons for sure. So Bill Marvel is wondering, do you have a sense that Revolutionary War pensions tend to be as exaggerated as Civil War pensions, and that interpretations based on them might be equally flawed?
The ones that I saw, particularly in connection with my relatives, were really affidavits by, 20 or 30 or 40 years later by half a dozen different people who sometimes said that they saw my great-great-great-great-grandfather participating, but most of them just said, well, we heard that he participated in those things. So, but I'm inclined to think that if you get 5 or 6 people saying in different words the same thing, you're inclined to believe them.
Art, do you have any comments?
I would agree with Tom. I think most of the petitions were credible. One of the other related issues was after the war was over, the soldiers hadn't been paid, and so they were given script, which enabled them to acquire land in the Northwest Territories. In most cases, they were, in a sense, defrauded because they needed cash, and so they sold them off at a big discount, which I think left a lot of resentment towards the way veterans were treated.
Keep in mind that the government was pretty strapped for income, and many of the pensions were basically disallowed for technical reasons. Maybe they didn't have all the T's crossed and I's dotted, but it was hard to get a pension.
Yeah, there was some bureaucracy involved, I'm sure. I know the two of you might have questions for each other. Do you have any questions?
Well, I might, Tom, did you follow up on how things went from the Battle of Guilford Courthouse to Cornwallis's surrender in Virginia?
I do have a book on that, and it's, as I mentioned before, at the end. I mean, it's another story, and it's a very interesting one.
My sense is he finally got trapped because the French Navy got there before the British Navy could get there to lift him off. And he was surrounded on land and water.
Yeah, French were really key to that. I mean, Washington had a fixation with New York, and Rochambeau, who wrote the book on siege warfare. Washington really didn't know much about siege warfare. And it was Rochambeau's plan, and of course, de Grasse's defeat of the British Navy that prevented the Cornwallis from being evacuated from Yorktown. But I have a question for you, Art, and that is the relationship between Cornwallis and General Clinton. It didn't seem to be all that great.
No, as I mentioned, Clinton didn't get on well with anybody. He was, in Wilcox's portrait of Clinton points him out, portrays him as somebody who had a very troubled childhood, and I think was abused, and he ended up with a very hostile feeling towards authority. And that's why he didn't get on with the Howe brothers, and he argued with Howe all the time, and Howe ignored his suggestions. And then when Clinton, the problem with Clinton was, for Cornwallis, was Clinton was in New York and Cornwallis was in Virginia, and he could hardly direct him very well from that distance. But there was a lot of friction between them two.
And Cornwallis, when he actually went into Virginia, he scarcely communicated with Clinton at all, and whatever information he got from Clinton seemed to be very confusing. Clinton initially was extremely annoyed that basically Cornwallis had abandoned the Carolinas. He thought he should be stay in Charleston and maintain the British control of the southern states.
Yes.
Do either of you have any last comments that you'd like to mention before we sign off for today?
I would just mention I appreciate the opportunity to participate in the Bookworm. And I always loved the Clements Library. I worked there a lot when I was a graduate student. And you do have some spectacular manuscripts. And one of the most interesting ones, which relates to this topic, was that there was a letter from Burgoyne to Clinton in which he basically, that I was saying, help me. But he didn't want to get that message on the letter because he was afraid it might get captured. So he sent the letter, and then he sent separately a mask, which he put on top of the letter, and it changes the entire context of the letter. The initial letter without the mask seems to say everything's going fine. I'm winning, and when you put the mask on, it shows help.
That is an amazing document. I am floored by the ability to write it and to have, it's not easy to write a letter that says one thing with the other letter inside of it in that weird shape. So it had to take a couple of tries, I would think.
The other thing that's interesting is that all of the major generals after the war wrote their memoirs, basically blaming the others for the loss of the American colonies. Certainly Cornwallis and Clinton did, and the generals underneath them. But it's interesting to read each of their accounts, recognizing that they're really trying to cover their own mistakes.
Yeah, definitely a lot of political backpedaling there. Exactly. All right. Well, thank you so much for participating in previous Bookworms as an attendee and for taking the time out of your schedule to participate now as a panelist. We really appreciate your efforts on behalf of the Clements Library, and I look forward to seeing you both hopefully in person sometime again soon.
Absolutely.
Once you're open.
Yes, exactly. So, all right. Well, thank you very much to both of you. And thanks everybody for attending today. And we look forward to next week as well. So goodbye.
Bye.